started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin, for public power enthusiasts without and within.
I'm Paul Dockery, a Senior Manager of Energy Resource Strategy and Planning for Seattle City Light and an energy enthusiast.
I'm Ahlmahz Negash, a Principal Resource Planning Analyst for Tacoma Power, an energy systems researcher, and an energy justice enthusiast.
I'm Conleigh Byers, an environmental fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, researching grid decarbonization and electricity market design.
And I'm Farhad Billimoria, director in electricity markets for S&P and visiting research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies.
We are joined today by a special celebrity guest, Lynne Kiesling. Hello, Lynne.
Hi, Paul.
Welcome. Lynne is an economist focusing on regulation, market design, and the economics of digitization and smart grid technologies in the electricity industry. She's the director of the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics at Northwestern University. She's also an adjunct professor at Northwestern and a research professor at the University of Colorado. Lynne directs an annual workshop for public utility commissioners and staff on the foundational principles of regulatory decision-making in technologically dynamic environments. Economics is hard for me to say. Anything in your bio I need to update, Lynne?
The only things I would add is I'm on the external faculty of the Santa Fe Institute. And so the complex adaptive system thing might be relevant to our conversation. So I will add that on here. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where I direct a working group where we're putting together a kind of forward-looking blue ribbon type report on a future vision for a clean and prosperous energy future.
Thank you. Thank you for those additions. I'll make sure that we get those in the show notes as well. I also have found your writing on transactive energy. Is it fair to say you are a champion of transactive energy? Is that fair or unfair?
I would say it's pretty fair. Yeah. I mean, and it's hard because, and this is something that gets drilled into you early on in your economics training, is that, your professional role is to be positive, not normative. And so what you're doing is analysis and not advocacy. But of course, those lines aren't as bright as as theory might want them to be.
Fair.
So I would say,
fair.
yeah, I'm an advocate. I've been, working on transactive energy since the original project in the Olympic Peninsula in the Pacific Northwest in the mid 2000s.
Wow.
So this is unusual for us to have our celebrity with all of the hosts, but Farhad, Conleigh, Ahlmahz, we're so excited to be part of this conversation. So we're all here. Anything you all want to ask of Lynne before we get into it, Ahlmahz or Conleigh or Farhad?
No, I'm just in shock and awe at having a superstar of electricity market, or another superstar in the mix. We've already got a handful that I regularly talk with here. So
I think there's going to be a lot of mutual appreciation going around the table here, because Farhad in particular, I have a pile of your papers in my to read list, all of which are about, pricing risk and allocating risk and how we need to do a better job of that, which will show up in some of my next research projects with some of our mutual friends.
fantastic.
Looking forward to it. Conleigh, last time we recorded without you because you were under the weather. Are you on the mend, and are you back excited about the episode?
Back in action. Yes,
and
back in action.
From Zurich?
That's right.
Okay. Well, we have Australia, Zurich, Chicago, and the Pacific Northwest. This is exactly our World Cup analogy is definitely going to be in ripe this time. So on today's episode, we're going to discuss the classification system used in economics to distinguish public goods from private goods, and what classifying some services as common pool resources means for grid planning and market design. And because I'm not an economist and don't know much. We're going to bracket our discussion with games to help me make better sense of it all. We're starting with a favorite segment, 30 Seconds of Theory. We have a lot of concepts and context to cover for the conversation. So, Lynn, I'm going to ask you, we're going to do this in a lightning round, 30 Seconds of Theory. And after one of our experts describes a topic, if you agree, just give us a ding. And if you don't, a buzz. And since I didn't give you a soundboard, you're just going to have to say ding or buzz. Is that okay?
Okay.
Okay, perfect. And then our producer will put something in post, and hopefully it makes it all fun. I'm going to start with you, Ahlmahz. In 30 Seconds of Theory, what is a public good?
All right, let's see if I can get buzzed out immediately. So a public good has two characteristics. It is non-rival and it's non-excludable. So non-rival means that once this good is in place, one person benefiting from it doesn't take away from another person benefiting from it. So I like to give an example of a street light. If we put a street light out, if Paul decides to go stand under the street light and read, it doesn't mean that there's less light available for Farhad to now come along and read. So it's non-rival. It also is non-excludable, which means that once it's put in place, you can't exclude someone from it. So if Paul is sitting there reading, he can't exactly prevent Farhad from getting that light. He can walk by and have it as well. So those are the two characteristics of a public good. But I feel like that's a very simplistic view of public goods. And it doesn't consider those things that can temporarily take on public good characteristics, but when they become crowded, they lose some of those characteristics. So I still consider congestible public goods to be public goods, just not pure public goods. And that's my 30 seconds.
Okay, give it a ding or buzz, Lynn.
Ding, ding, ding.
All right.
Nailed it. Also,
I mean, if I were being pedantic, I was going to be like, but what about congestion? But because this public, the rival, non-rival, excludable, non-excludable, it creates these binary extremes when in both dimensions it's really more of a continuum. So if you have like a 2x2 continuum space.
All right.
all right. What a way to start it. Good job, Ahlmahz. Farhad, you're up next. What is a common pool resource in 30 seconds of theory?
So think of a big bowl of candy in the middle of a room, and everyone can just take as much as they want. And it's a regenerative bowl of candy that regenerates at a certain rate, right? Now, if everyone goes and grabs as much as they want, you're not going to have enough to necessarily share, and it's going to impact everyone. So a common pool resource is a resource that is not easy to exclude someone from using, but it's rival in that my use affects your use. So common examples are forests. If everyone goes in and just harvests the forest, cuts down the trees at a rate beyond what the forest can regenerate, it's going to deplete the forest and it's going to destroy the forest. Same thing as, common water bodies or fisheries is another example. So these types of goods are really complicated, and is that further nuance from this idea of public goods that this is actually, I think, one of the biggest challenges that we see everywhere in economics and indeed the world, is how do we manage these goods which are not rival, that are rival but not excludable.
What do you think, Lynn? How do you do?
Ding, ding, ding. And in fact, the candy bowl is a great metaphor, because when I was teaching environmental economics, I always use classroom experiments to make it very active. And a couple of years, I would do a fisheries experiment where I would put candy in paper bags and put them in different places around the classroom. And there was a set of rules, and you do different, period 1, period 2, and then you replenish the bags at a certain rate. And in the period where it was open access, so there was no limitation on your ability to go and grab the candy fish, I had a few football players in my class that quarter, and some of the athleticism in going and diving and scooping all of the bags of candy was really impressive. So
I'm going to violate the rules of 30 Seconds of Theory and ask a follow-up question. So what is the distinction between a congestible public good that what Ahlmahz was talking about and a common pool resource that Farhad was just mentioning? Is there a difference there, like an important distinction that we need to make?
yeah, I think that's something for us to discuss.
Oh, good. Well, let's get into it later and let's keep going. Conleigh, up next, 30 Seconds of Theory. What is a club good?
A club good is non-rival, but it is excludable. Think like an online New York Times subscription. You can put up a paywall to prevent access, so it's excludable, but my access doesn't limit or detract from your access unless perhaps under extreme congestion. So as Lynn was saying, these really aren't just binaries. And at some point, if so many users tried to access that system, the server could go down. And then we would have some rivalry.
I think this game is working. I'm loving this. This is good. This is such a good way to do the context. Anything you want to add, Lynn?
I just to put some history of economic thought on Conleigh's completely accurate definition. The seminal paper on club goods is from James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 1986. One of the set, along with Ken Arrow and some others, of the founders of public choice economics. And one of the branches of his work and of public choice economics is this focus on club goods and what does it imply? And it applies to, he first started developing it, and the Theory of Clubs paper was published in 1965. And he had been, for the previous decade, had been spending time working on what was a really interesting question, going back to a literature from England in the late 1920s, early 1930s, on studying highway pricing. And how do you price highways to get the quote unquote optimal amount and capacity and connections of highways? And so toll roads for him were an example of a club good.
Fascinating. I'm glad we're getting this theoretical foundation for our discussion. You're next up, actually, Lynn, and I get to buzz or ding you.
Okay.
Using whatever criteria I decide. What is the pacing problem?
The pacing problem is the problem in the situation where you have law or a body of regulation, which is, almost every single situation in human life, where you have a set of regulations that affect the decisions that are made in a particular industry or a particular market, and that market experiences technological change. And the technological change either changes the nature of the good or how it's produced, or can change the market boundaries itself. But that the technology changes really quickly, but the institutions change very slowly. And so that's the pacing problem, the technological and institutional change timing mismatch.
So you shared a paper when you used this term. I found it incredibly helpful in framing for the way I think. Like, I don't know. Like I mentioned, not an economist, not a topic that I had really encountered before, but incredibly useful for a mental model about how our institutions evolve or lag behind technological progress. So ding, ding, ding.
I completely agree. I've adopted it from the tech law community and some of the researchers that I know over there. Super helpful.
Perfect. Okay. I had so many concepts I wanted to cover. We're actually going to do this twice. I'm going back to Ahlmahz. What is a collective action problem?
So the collective action problem is this unfortunate situation that stems from human beings, unfortunately, sometimes being selfish. So it's a situation when you have a group of individuals that if they would only cooperate and collaborate in their decision making or actions, that it would be optimal for everyone. But because they each have their own individual objectives, and those objectives can sometimes be conflicting, they all act in their own individual interests. And so that group optimization doesn't happen, and it's a suboptimal issue or solution that happens in the end.
Ding, ding, ding.
Nailed it.
And I mean, it's great because I mean, there's the perfect representation of it, and it draws on some of the strands. You know, part of one way that you can think about public choice economics is it's the field that applies economic theory to understanding our behavior and our decisions in non-market settings. And one of the primary challenges that public choice economics deals with is the collective action problem, right? Because you're in these non-market settings, and so you can't use market signals and price signals to coordinate and plan and invest and innovate. And so you do things through political mechanisms and negotiation and political bargaining where there isn't a price mechanism to mediate the negotiation.
Okay. Well, I want to know what Farhad thinks about the tragedy of the commons, and I'm very curious on how it relates to a collective action problem. So Farhad, take it away, 30 seconds of theory. What is the tragedy of the commons?
Okay, so the tragedy of the commons basically is the problem that emerges when we are using a shared resource, and when everyone acting in their self-interests just consumes the resource to the point beyond where, if it's a regenerating resource, beyond the point at which it can regenerate. And so you deplete that resource, which is intended for everybody, but because you can't exclude someone easily, you end up depleting the resource. Our environment is a great example. If everyone just pollutes however they want, or uses our common our common goods however they want, it depletes that resource. Fisheries, water bodies, the clean air that we breathe, it's all, I think, one of the most fundamental problems of shared use.
Okay, Lynn, what do you think?
Ding, ding, ding.
I was hoping you were going to buzz somebody. Come on, Lynn. I was counting on you. Okay.
So all the pressure's on Conleigh now. No, and these examples of tragedy of the commons are illustrations of their instances of collective action problems, because you have this misalignment of incentives. And so at this point, I need to name check my Shiro, Eleanor Ostrom. And Ostrom's work, she won the Nobel Prize in 2009, I think, but for her work on governing the commons, right? How do we come up with institutions to govern our resource use and avoid these tragedy of the commons situations and avoid getting in collective action problems? And at their core, these problems are problems of property rights, that we just can't perfectly define property rights. And again, it's one of these things where it's not a binary public-private, it's a continuum from, like, a pure private good might be my contact lenses, because those are mine and I'm not sharing them with anyone, and nobody's going to want them because that's gross. And, at the other end is the completely open access. It's just not feasible to try to define property rights in that setting. And usually we think of things there like, and there's a lot of overlap there with the public good, non-excludable, non-rival, hard to define property rights. So things like national defense end up over in that part of the continuum. And then air and water and climate are kind of shading in that direction. But then even on the more private, you've got sort of public parks. Within a household, you've got the family cookie jar where the parents make the rules and the kids have to live by them, and so that rule is an Ostrom style governance.
I think we're going to get a lot more into Ostrom's work in some of the follow-up conversations. This is a nice foreshadowing of what that what's to come. I'm glad you brought up private goods. I didn't do a 30 seconds of theory for private goods because it felt like we were just going to cover it anyway, and you did, so that's perfect. Next one up, Conleigh, what is induced demand?
Okay, so I guess we're going for the perfect streak here for the public power underground regulars. So induced demand is a phenomenon in which an increase in supply leads to a reduction in price and a new higher equilibrium level of demand. So think expanding a highway. You add another lane, now that highway is less congested, more trips are now taken by car, often until that highway has just as bad of traffic as it did before the expansion.
Ding, ding, ding. If you build it, they will come. Yep.
Anything to add on it, Lynn?
I think just since obviously I'm on a history of thought bender today. Well, I'm on a history of thought bender every day, but the one place where people might want to connect the dots on this in the kind of energy and environment space that we inhabit is this shows up when we talk about the effects of how technological change can reduce costs, but that induces people to consume more. And so this goes all the way back to the work of William Stanley Jevons on the coal question in the 19th century. And, you know, it comes up when we talk about climate and climate policy and the idea that making processes more energy efficient means that you're consuming less energy per unit of activity, but that also makes it cheaper to do that activity, so you might do more. So if you have a more energy efficient car, it might mean you pay less to fuel your car, but that may mean that you drive more, and that would more, you know, at least cut into or maybe more than offset the energy savings you get from the energy efficiency. So Conleigh, was that what you had in mind?
Well, yes, I think the induced demand of highways transportation is pretty well documented by this point. But yes, certainly also some backfire effects in a lot of energy efficiency plans where you might end up consuming more energy than you had to begin with.
You know, I'm going to add one thing. Sorry, Paul. So you might remember when we had Dr. Destiny Knock last season, but she mentioned something similar to this. But I wouldn't necessarily, I wonder if you would call it induced demand, but there are certain communities who are limiting, like they're not using as much electricity as they should. They're keeping their house at an unsafe temperature because they can't afford it. But when you give them energy, when they have access to energy efficiency, yes, they start to use more energy, but they're basically using what they should have had they been able to afford electricity in the first place. So, and she often would say that is justice. It's not, you know, like people being able to use what they need is justice. It's not necessarily I don't know if I want to call it induced demand or a failure of conservation, essentially. But just want to throw that out there, that what we might call induced demand does not necessarily have to be a bad thing.
I would agree with that.
Great. Well, Lynn, I think you also recently wrote a paper about AI on the grid, and I'm actually curious whether some of the use of energy for new sort of technological processes like blockchain or AI is also an example of induced demand from low prices of electricity, or if that's not.
I think it's more complicated, but I am going to take advantage of your mention to do a shameless self-promotion for my Substack, which is called Knowledge Problem. And since I know I'm up next on the 30-second for that topic. So knowledgeproblem.substack.com, and I am in the middle of a multi-part series on data center electricity use. And I think if you say take the you know, I guess I think of induced demand there in the sense of if you have a certain type of chip, like the traditional CPU, and you make that more energy efficient, so it doesn't require as much energy to cool. So you don't need to have as big an HVAC system for a given number of chips in your server farm, in your data center. but then you make those chips more energy efficient, then you can either get more chips in and more computing out of a given amount of energy use for HVAC, or, if you're going to do a lot more computing, then you can more than offset your energy efficiency because you're going to use more air conditioning. And
Well,
then
I'm glad I
change from the CPU to this GPU, the graphic processing unit chip that we're using for AI, that's a difference, and there are a lot of energy efficiency differences between the two, but the GPU consumes something like 10 times as much energy per chip use because it's doing many thousands more times the computation of the CPU. So it's doing a ton more work, but it's also using 10 times the energy.
I'm glad we got to at least tease that topic. I don't know if we're actually going to have time to get into that specific, like really interesting wonky topic today. I do also wonder if there is a lesson here around cost of service base rate and the differential between the value of electricity and its cost in that cost of service and versus its value to customers in the consumer surplus for these type of activities. And if you have any thoughts, just in 30 seconds of theory on like what that means in the electric sector, where there is a wide difference between the cost and the value of electricity.
I do think, it's a really good point, and it's something that I've thought about a lot for a very long time, even before the AI situation brought it to our forefront so dramatically, that in the origins, and I should say I'm trained as an economic historian, so I think of these things from a historical perspective. And so if you think back to the early 20th century, when it was an electromechanical system, and basically all of us as consumers, we were all consumers. It was just a one-way flow. And the ways that we were using electricity, if you were a residential customer, were very similar. If you were a commercial customer, were very similar. If you were an industrial customer, using those new induction motors as opposed to the belt-driven stuff in your factories, the ways that we were using electricity by customer class were very similar. So there was a similarity of value within customer class. And so the value to cost relationship was pretty stable. But now I think it is so much more heterogeneous, and it does, I think, require us to do a good deep rethink about cost-based regulation.
You just blew my mind, and it's going to take me a long time to process it, which is why I love this podcast and love doing this, because I actually get to go back and listen and then think hard about what you said and go back, rewind 15 seconds, 15 times. But unless anybody else wants to follow on that so that future Paul can listen to you respond to that, we can move on to that. Farhad, Conleigh, Ahlmahz, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think maybe we could tie this back in to the pacing problem as well. So when we're thinking about traditional cost of service regulation and why is it that these institutions can't keep up well with technological change as well as we would hope, well, a lot of the times it comes down to the incentive structures those organizations had. So can relate that pretty well back to Ari Pesco from the last episode and thinking about what are the incentives that this organization has. Does it really have the incentive to innovate or to become more efficient when presented with changing input parameters?
And I think there's also, again, to pull on the historian string, that there is a more social cultural component of it that, and Paul, in your case, I think might lead you and I to different conclusions. And I know, just given the interactions that we've had, I think we do reach different conclusions about this, but that I think you can trace it back in part to some of the social cultural meaning that different people attach to the electric system and what it does and what it means to be a participant in it, and how do you define the public interest and what constitutes the public interest, and is the public interest something more or less than just providing a public good or is it even providing a public good? So I think there's a whole lot of other stuff, connected to your question.
Yeah, and I appreciate we probably do end up in some different places, and I love that. It's going to be fun. Going to make this whole episode fun. And we do end with you on the 30 seconds of theory with the grand finish. What is the knowledge problem?
The knowledge problem is the name that a 1980s, 90s economist named Don Lavoie gave to the fundamental epistemological problem of, I guess, I would say of humanity. And it goes back to the economist Friedrich Hayek. And he really clearly stated it in his 1945 American Economic Review article, The Use of Knowledge in Society. And the knowledge problem, as he never used that phrase, but the concept is the idea that we each individually have our own perceptions of cost and benefit. We have our own preferences, we have our own perceptions of opportunity cost, and it's really only within the context of, and the language he used was being the man on the street and having that man on the street's knowledge of time and place, that only if you have all of the knowledge available to that person in that setting at that moment, can you understand and replicate the decision, the information, the knowledge that he brings to making choices in that setting. And so this was in the context of what was called the socialist calculation debate of the 1930s. And Hayek's argument was that Soviet-style central planning cannot replicate market outcomes because knowledge is so personal, so cognitive, and so perception driven, and so diffuse among individuals. And so no one person or government can aggregate it and replicate it in any meaningful way.
And I've heard you, I think, elsewhere articulate that these sort of pricing mechanisms of a market are the most efficient way to coordinate those kind of diversity of perspectives. And that's, I think, how you get to a perspective, or I don't want to say that, but and transactive energy can be a way where that type of knowledge and pricing signal can organize activity across our electric sector. Is that fair?
I mean, you've just cut exactly to, I'm in the transactive energy work where we, are building with my co-authors and collaborators, we're building a platform where you can have your devices submit bids, your thermostat, your water heater, your electric vehicle, your battery can submit bids to willingness to pay and also offers willingness to sell if you're a battery or an EV into a local energy market, and just use price signals to perform what the engineers would call, using PID control theory, so Farhad can check me on that, the device control function that you need in engineered systems, and use the price signal to do that. And it's through that coordination. And that's really Hayek's main argument, is that the primary economic problem in societies is not the allocation of resources, which is, if you go into an econ principles class, one of the most textbooks, the first thing they'll tell you is economics is about the allocation of scarce resources among unlimited wants. And back in 1945, Hayek said, no, it's, that's part of it. But what it's really about is coordinating the actions and plans of a whole bunch of people who have their own life projects and don't know each other and can't really communicate with each other. And yet we still manage to seem to get, in the example he used was, tin getting produced. In 1776, Adam Smith used the same idea to talk about how the worker's woolen coat gets manufactured, even though the worker doesn't know who makes the buttons or who tends the sheep that create the wool. All of this stuff still seems to happen in this decentralized way. And it's part of the beauty, and it's not perfect, right? But then one of the other arguments about the knowledge problem is that then that creates an entrepreneurial opportunity if you're perceptive and you can spot errors. And, whether they're errors that are caused by regulation or errors that are caused by something about market rules, some market incompleteness, if you can spot errors and you can make money by correcting those errors, then that can be mutually beneficial for more people than just you.
Farhad, she called you out specifically, and I don't feel adequate to ding or buzz on Lynn's answer to that question. So I'm going to put you on the spot, Farhad. Are you going to ding or buzz that answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Ding that. Buzz that. Well, wait, hang on. Ding or buzz? It's ding, right?
You can do both.
Ding, ding, ding.
Producer Sarah, I want to go back and forth for at least a minute of buzz and ding. Give us both.
There's morning confusion. Yeah, look, I think to me that's a really, that goes at the heart of what we're trying to do with the energy system as well, right? Because you've got so many different participants. When we talk about the consumer, we in so many jurisdictions, and I've read so many papers that talk about the consumer as this sort of one size fits all, but the level of knowledge, the level of awareness, the level of even willingness to engage in the market, the level of importance that folks attach to it, it really is so varied. And so to me, the question of centralized versus decentralized, it's a really, really important question, because there's probably some aspects where, at least in terms of understanding and engaging with people with different appreciations of energy and what it means for them in their daily lives, there's probably some element where you can standardize, or at least harness or standardize knowledge, or template the knowledge so that people can understand easily what they're buying or selling now in some cases. But then there's also this broader dynamic of people wanting to just make decisions of what is important to them. I mean, at 8 o'clock in the night when it's really cold, you're going to put the heater on, regardless of how much, elasticity you may have. Your family may not. Your partner may decide, I don't care what the price is, put the heater on. So that's where I think this coordination aspect and price formation is really important. And I think especially as we get down to the consumer level, that awareness, that the issue of vulnerability and the issue of just understanding what you're purchasing, that becomes a really important issue. And even though I think as professionals in the space, we can maybe get that complexity just because we look at it every day, it's not always the case that translates through. And sometimes the right, complex bill structure may not necessarily be the right solution for consumers. So that's also an important aspect of that sort of bill design, tariff design, and of engaging now in this sort of bi-directional energy system.
Well said. Well said. And I'm glad to have the conversation. I think that game was just a rousing success. We covered so much concept, so many concepts, so much history in what ended up being longer than expected. We're going to dig into some more very specific, very deep, wonky topics, but we're going to take a quick break first for a word from our sponsor. And then we're going to come back for a discussion of grid services as a bundle of goods and the implication on market design and system planning.
This Public Power Underground is sponsored by Renewable Northwest. Renewable Northwest is a regional renewable energy advocacy organization with a unique and powerful coalition of members that include renewable energy developers, energy buyers and marketers, ratepayer advocates, and environmental NGOs. At our core, we're a bunch of wonky energy nerds working with other energy nerds to build a clean, reliable energy future in the Pacific Northwest. Learn more about Renewable Northwest at renewablenw.org.
Okay, we're structuring our discussion as 3 questions from our 3 experts. First, a categorization of power system security products and services as a basket of goods. Second, big public infrastructure versus decentralized coordination. Third, what it means for governance, market design, and system planning. In 2022, Farhad actually co-authored a paper classifying power system security products and services using these characteristics of excludability and subtractability. So Farhad, I'm going to hand it off to you to start with what is and what is not a public good in the electric system?
So I should mention that this work borrows heavily and was really inspired by Lynne and Michael Gibbison's work in 2004, where you talked about the congestible and common pool nature of grids. And I think, and then in a subsequent book, you also talked about network reliability as being a common pool resource. So this work tries to build upon that in terms of breaking down some of the more emergent power system security problems that we see in the grid. So one of the most important aspects of operating a grid in terms of keeping the lights on is maintaining, especially in an AC system, maintaining the frequency of the electric signal and maintaining voltages at appropriate levels around the grid, so that you don't get voltage overload or line sag and all these problems that can essentially cause blackouts. And so these system security problems have their own particular physical characteristics. So the physics of electrical networks, what we were arguing then flows into how you think about the economics. And so the way we think about frequency security and the products that we procure in the market. So in the market, obviously in the modern electricity market, we procure energy, or we have a framework for essentially privatizing energy. And then we also procure, or the operator will procure, a range of these frequency products or other grid services. And so what we did was analyze each of those services and try to understand, do they actually fall into a bucket of public goods, private goods, common pool resources, club goods. And so what we found was, as we analyze all these different services, because of the physical nature of these services, they actually tend to reflect a different economic characterization. So something like frequency, which is really a system-wide product, and there's this idea of a constant frequency across the system, that tended to be more towards this idea of a public good. And inertia is one example, where basically the fact that you can have these big heavy turbines injecting this mechanical energy into the system to slow frequency, everyone can access that and everyone benefits from that. So that was this idea of sort of being a public good, pretty close to it. Not perfect, but somewhere in that box. And then on the other side of it was something like what is this really new and emergent area called system strength, where this idea that in especially very sparse areas of the grid, when you have a fault or some sort of disturbance in the grid, there was actually a natural mechanical response and magnetic response of thermal generators to actually boost the voltage back up. So when you had a voltage sag or a voltage disturbance, there's actually a natural response to bring it back. Now, what we observe in grids that are very high inverter-based generation, at least the first generation of technology, is they tend to consume that service, but because of the way that they interact with the system, they don't actually deliver that electromechanical response. Mm-hmm. And so that tended to be more what we classified as a common pool resource, because people can use it, and the addition of new generators or new users of that service depletes that service for everybody. But it's very hard to exclude someone from getting the value of system strength, for example. So that was where we kind of broke it all down, and we said, well, the way we think about these grid services, it's not a one size fits all. It's actually what we call a basket of goods that falls into these different categories. And so when you're regulating for that, when you're creating markets for that, you've got to respect and you've got to understand the physics to then create the economic instruments to ultimately achieve the outcome that you want from a societal perspective.
So Lynne, I think I read a piece on Substack, another plug for your Substack, about network reliability as a differentiated product. Farhad mentioned that as well, that the way they think about you could differentiate a product and it becomes, did I get that right? A common pool resource, Farhad? I'm
Yeah.
curious what your perspective is on that, Lynn, and how
And
that works within
one of
Farhad's
the
framework.
things that's going to be really useful here is this reminded me that I read Farhad's paper on this and didn't cite it in the paper. I have two projects I'm working on right now that are very Ostrom focused and touch on these questions. And one of them in particular needs that taxonomy. And so I read it and didn't manage to get the citation in there. I think it's one of those LaTeX things, where I put it in parentheses, but I didn't actually put it in the reference.bib file, so it didn't show up in the paper. But anyway, and I think this is one of the interesting things I think, given how interdisciplinary the energy space is, and that we have these conversations across our disciplines. And that one of the things that I think between engineers and economists, because we're kind of talking about similar concepts, but at different levels of detail. And so it often takes a while to try to unpack. And we certainly found this in the transactive energy work, that it took us a few years to realize that, in PID control theory, when the engineers say control, that how do we crosswalk that into what we mean in economics about coordination with price signals. But in the stuff that I've worked on, including what Farhad mentioned with Mike Giberson those many years ago, that essentially the way we come at it from a kind of institutional economics perspective, again, channeling Ostrom, is thinking about it in terms of this question of how well can you define the property rights in the system, right? And so when you think about property rights, I don't think it's too far off to go back to Garrett Hardin's old Tragedy of the Commons article and think about the medieval English village and the common field where they graze their animals, and that you can privatize that by putting up fences, but then you lose a whole bunch of the kind of shared farming benefits that you get from having it be an open access field. And so you need to come up with an Ostrom style set of governance institutions to manage your shared use of the shared resource. And so coming at it from that perspective, if you think about reliability in an AC system, it's something that we all consume. And I would argue, and this maybe pulls on the justice string a bit, I would argue that we don't consume the same level of reliability. That different consumers actually experience different levels of reliability, and that some of that has to do with historic differences in investment in the grid in particular neighborhoods at a distribution level. But thinking more at the transmission level, that you can't really define property rights in the grid unless you do so through some kind of mutually agreed upon contractual means. So like firm transmission rights, says basically, at 2:00 on Friday, January 12th, I have the right to transport 500 kilowatts worth of power on your grid, and that we have to use those kind of contractual mechanisms to coordinate how we're using this shared system, because with Kirchhoff's law and all the stuff that I'll let Farhad explain because I'm not an engineer, we end up with not having well-defined property rights. And so we end up with differential experience of reliability, both negatively from differences in historic investment, but we could also, to Farhad's point, we could use technology and markets essentially to buy different levels of reliability reflecting different preferences we may have. So the idea of what Hung Po Chow and Robert Wilson in the 1980s wrote about called priority insurance, where you think of it as, I buy an insurance contract, I buy my place in line, and if I'm willing to pay more to keep my power on, but maybe maybe Conleigh's willing to pay less because she knows that she has some on-site backup that she can rely on, and that it's going to be cheaper for her to use her backup than to buy the insurance. Right? So I think that's kind of the economics prism through which I would look at Farhad's really important work.
Yeah, I thought this was a great paper, Farhad, and that was a great summary you gave of it here. Something that I think is important to think about in this context where we're trying to unite the engineers and the economists, right? Where we know that there's a lot of things changing. We're trying to now use grid enhancing technologies rather, grid forming technologies instead of just grid following technologies. How would we create markets around this for different ancillary services, some of which we previously got for free, if you will, like inertia with the large synchronous machines. Something to always pay attention to, though, is to think not how are we providing the service now and trying to get that same product, but rather what is the service that we need to provide? So for instance, the grid doesn't necessarily need inertia per se. It needs to keep its technical parameters within some limits, but it could do that via very fast frequency response instead. And so thinking about how, okay, inertia, we might think of it as this public good now, but perhaps in a lot of ways, what we're really trying to do is provide some system service, and that very much could be procured in a market-based context as well.
It's interesting. I do want to follow up on Farhad's question about what is and isn't a public good in the grid. I believe you and I have different opinions on this, but I just want to confirm, Lynn, what is your perspective on transmission infrastructure? Is it or is it not a public good? So like Farhad talked about services, but this is more of infrastructure. So what's your view on that?
I think this is a where you stand depends on where you sit type of situation, right? Because and I will call out and this is some conversations I think Conleigh and I have been in together that also have included Kelly Joseph, who's at the Climate Center at Penn, who has written some papers arguing that that the electric system actually and the transmission system is a public good. And her work caused me to and working on this current project that I'm working on that uses Buchanan's theory of clubs made me go back and rethink what exactly I mean. And it's the where you stand depends on where you sit. That I think from a consumer's perspective, you can think of this world where you would have differential reliability and priority insurance. And in that case, the reliability to the consumer would be more of a common pool resource. But I think that from the consumer's perspective right now, the way they interact with the grid and the way they experience their engagement with the electric system, that it is a public good. But it's not, and so I think that gets to the next observation I would make, which is that sometimes things are public goods because they have those technical characteristics of rivalry, non-rivalry, and non-excludability. And sometimes things are public goods because we have declared them thus. And I think this is a case where we have declared them thus. But if you go back to, 1907, when we started the public utility commissions in Wisconsin and New York, that was all we could do technologically. And so I think this is, we have declared them to be a public good, even if they aren't always necessarily they don't always fully have all those technical characteristics.
So this is where we've now reached the discussion where earlier Paul asked, what's that distinguishing factor? What distinguishes a congestible public good from a common pool resource? And I'll give you my take on it because I know everybody has an opinion about it. But for me, transmission is a lot different from fishing, right? We can fish a species to extinction. And we have indeed hunted certain species to extinction. So those we can call them common pool resources. But the infrastructure, like the transmission infrastructure, although they can get congested, at the end of the day, that resource will be there. It is not depletable. It's still there. And so you can manage that congestion and get it back to, pull it back to that point where it has those characteristics of being non-rival and not excludable. But you can't really deplete infrastructure. So that's how I distinguish between those two and why I consider transmission actually a congestible public good. And I also agree that when it comes to what is excludable, technically you can cut somebody off of electricity. So it is technically excludable, but when we have a policy, for example, that says, as a society, we are not going to cut off a person's electricity and heating to their home when it's minus 20 degrees outside. We can't. So I have, as a planner, I have to build the system to meet that peak, whether or not that person is going to, pay or not. So the system has to be there, and it's technically not excludable because we've declared it as thus, just as you mentioned, Lynn. Anyway, I fully thought you were going to disagree with me on transmission being a public good. I am pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, I mean, I do still, because my definition of what is or is not a common pool resource boils down to how well defined are the property rights.
Yeah.
And, in an AC system, they're not very well defined at all. It's physically impossible to do so. But that definition doesn't take into account your point about depletion and depreciation.
I guess I might poke at the idea that it's, impossible to think about property rights in the transmission context. And so in some ways, yes, but in another, that's what a financial transmission right? Is saying that there's this imaginary contract path, but that's actually very hard to construct because of the externalities from the way that the energy actually flows in the power grid. So instead, you can just think of it as buying at one location, selling at another. The difference between that is really that value of that transmission.
Yeah, input and offtake. And this, to me, this is where Ostrom really comes in. And I think the relevance of her arguments is underappreciated. And so I'm in these papers I'm working on, I'm trying to amplify her. And it's exactly this idea that you have this underlying physical reality, and in much of her work, she was focused on irrigation systems, and whether it's in the American West or in Cambodia or other places around the world. So you have these irrigation systems, and from year to year, of course, the volume of water that's available will vary. And so the members who can all, offtake from that system, they have to come up with a set of use rights to make sure that everyone gets at least some of however much water there is, and especially, some of it in very, very dry years, and then, that they share the bounty in what they perceive to be a just fashion in the wet years. And so yeah, for me, there's this underlying physical reality, and then we come up with the contractual institutional arrangement to help us essentially create, in her language, it's create use rights in the common pool. Yeah, so yeah, that's exactly the way I've been trying to think about it. I'm also interested, I don't know if any of you all have backgrounds in natural gas, but one person I know who has a long set of expertise in the oil and gas industry asked me, how is the kind of AC fact that the physical flow and the contract path can't necessarily match, how is that different from natural gas flowing through a pipeline network? And I just don't know that industry well enough. But if any of you do, I'd be interested to learn about it.
Lynn, I'm a millennial that entered the electric industry right out of college, and I was like, natural gas is going to be obsolete. I'm not worried about. I'm going to learn that, but that's antiquated stuff. That's for the Gen Xers and Boomers. I'm here to think about electricity. I learned maybe
Can't
I still
say-
needed to care about natural gas. Don't get me wrong. It's still really important and I've learned more. I don't know how it actually works though. Go ahead, Conleigh.
Well, I can't say I'm an expert in natural gas markets by any means, but I think something that really distinguishes the electricity market from other markets, including natural gas, is that there is a really non-negotiable requirement of coordination in order for there to be competition. And that doesn't exist in most networks, where you really, because there isn't a feasible way to store electricity economically, we're matching, and because of system security reasons, to keep the power grid within certain parameters, we're matching supply and demand in real time. And I don't know that there is such a central coordinating problem that's as robust as that in the natural gas market.
Mhm. That's
And I think,
helpful.
and I think also the fact that, I mean, just leveraging on that point, the shared nature of the resource, and especially transmission, you can build two duplicative natural gas plants, and you can direct which pipe sorry, did I say plants? Pipelines, right, from A to B, and you can direct gas flows on each of those, just by separating the pressure differentials. And so, but having two transmission lines from A to B, they're going to actually, the law, Kirchhoff's laws say that whatever you put through, you can't tell the electrons where to go. So you are going to, that it is going to be following a shared path. And that I think is one of the fundamental differences when we're trying to regulate transmission of electricity versus natural gas, where you can actually define a contract path and it can actually create an operational framework that aligns with that matches the physics. And I think that's harder to do for electricity. And I think that also complicates the regional picture, because when we talk about reliability, it tends to be on more segregated regional boundaries. Even here in Australia, it tends to focus on state by state reliability. And so individual states will have actions that they look to support reliability, but in a shared network, well, for good or bad, we can't actually designate electricity will flow. And so if there's a shortage in New South Wales, as long as you have the right line capacity and it's secure, it will flow through from New South Wales down to Victoria, or from Victoria to New South Wales, as it would across the states. And so that's where I think this, the physics doesn't follow the sovereign borders or the state borders that we define. And so sometimes we've got to adapt our mindset and our governance, our adaptive governance, to that physical reality. Sometimes that's harder to do because of politics and humans and everything else that we, just our way of operating. But I think that that's also important to note.
So
Mhm.
I know we gotta move on, because we gotta get to the game, but I do want to wrap up this transmission as a public good, and we can go on to Conleigh and do my question last if there's time, Paul. So if we consider transmission as a public good, I wonder how you feel that means, how that impacts the way we should allocate the costs of transmission or pay for transmission. What are your views on that? Because people think public good and taxes, right? So what are your thoughts on that?
And so just, spread the costs. And I think that's one of the, and putting together this whole conversation and building off of what Farhad just said about, this is very helpful, because it gets me to think in terms of metaphors, that even though they're all networks, that the natural gas pipeline network is more like, is more like a rail network. And the electric network, the transmission network, is not like them. And it's, that in rail we have switches, and in pipelines we have valves, in water pipelines we have valves, and that there is a physical difference. But to get back to your initial definition of the collective action problem, right, this need for coordination is precisely why, and especially coming as I do as an economist, who I would like to have as light a regulatory touch as possible and allow for markets to coordinate and, reduce transaction costs so that markets can do a better job of what they do well. But there are pieces of what has to happen in electric systems that require that kind of coordination we've been discussing, that mean that the collective action problem can't be eliminated. And so we have to have that coordination, and we have to, have it be through some non-market process. And at least not in the Pacific Northwest, but other chunks of the country and in Australia, we think of it as more of a grid operator, RTO type, setup. And I don't have a good answer for cost sharing. I am not gonna, I think, it's one of the reasons why FERC 1920, I think, was a useful step for clarifying, but is going to be challenged legally. But I think that's one of the hardest questions in these shared systems, is given how dynamic the physical reality is, from day to day, stuff that used to only maybe vary over seasons, with more intermittent resources on the grid, and now with storage, the conditions are going to vary from day to day, and who's getting what value out of what resource is going to vary from day to day. How do you do cost allocation in that system? So I'm inclined to think of it as more of a platform to try to answer that question, and just, come up with a service fee and just say, okay, the grid operator gets paid a service fee. Here's the menu of services the grid operator provides. So kind of like Airbnb, right? Here are the things that you do. You get paid this service fee. That might be a way of approaching it.
Fair enough. All right.
I think Jacob Mays, co-author of one of the papers, you've worked with him before, just close friend of the Underground. When I've talked to him before, he has also described transmission as a platform upon which the market operates. I think that's a really useful way to think about it. Doesn't withstand the question of, okay, how do you pay for the platform? We're going to move to Conleigh's question next, but one of the things Conleigh mentioned about this, the nature of balancing the electric system, made me want to ask a question to an astounding economist here. I listened to a presentation by Lyon Hirth about electric market designs, and he had this observation that what we're doing in electricity markets is we're taking the things we've observed from natural occurring markets, and we're applying them as rules on the operation of the electricity system as a structured market. And I would love your take, because I found that, and I love your analogy that this is just like a coordination and control signal across our system. That's the way I think, and I've come to think about our electricity markets. But it is a controlled signal. It is not, it's not natural. I don't know if a naturally occurring market is the right term or not. I don't know what the right term is, but it is not something that would naturally lend itself to bartering, I guess.
Yeah. So now we get into the anthropology and the ethnography, and and it's
which is your field, which is why I wanted to ask you.
Humans have an inherent tendency to truck, barter, and exchange. So apply Adam Smith here. Yeah. So markets are very organic systems of social cooperation, and in something that's as engineered a system as electricity, I think we often lose sight of the deeply human aspect of markets, and that because we have this, I would argue, unrealistic stereotype of thinking about competition and dog eat dog. That really, when it comes right down to it, if you talk about the competition is between sellers and sellers, and between buyers and buyers. Buyers and sellers are trying to coordinate to get some mutual benefit, right? So between a buyer and a seller, markets are processes of social cooperation. And they work better when you have a lot of buyers and a lot of sellers, so that you can get that kind of rich, robust, better chance of matching as much value with as low a cost as possible. But so that's the kind of thinking of markets as organic, emergent, processes for social cooperation. And because electricity is such an engineered system, and because markets are so relatively new, yeah, sure, we go back to economic theory and what has worked in other instances. And in particular, we can look at financial markets. So, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, so what kind of rules have worked well there? And so there are certain things you have to do. You have to define the product and its parameters. You have to define the rules for participation, creditworthiness, all that stuff. And you basically define what the auction design is that you're going to use. So there's a set of rules. And so it is a very designed system. So it's this hybrid kind of top-down design and bottom-up emergence. And it doesn't always, the design doesn't always, you can't copy paste, right? Just because something's going to work well for the butter market doesn't mean it's going to work for electricity. But that's why I think one of the most profoundly beneficial things that we've done and here I'm channeling the work of economist Steve Sakala, who's at Tufts. One of the most profoundly beneficial things that we've done is in organized wholesale power markets is implementing security constrained economic dispatch. And that, that's, the putting your chocolate in my peanut butter, putting your peanut butter in my chocolate, right? The two great tastes that taste great together. Security constrained means you've got to be able to physically deliver. Economic means you're going to have the incentives to build the supply stack from least cost to highest cost. And so you'll dispatch the units that are the best ones to dispatch in that period. Does that get, I suspect that probably overlaps a lot with what Lion was talking about.
Yeah, and I didn't prep for that question. It just occurred to me as Conleigh was talking, so I wanted to get it. But I think it does highlight, because it's a designed market that is based on engineered rules, the pacing problem is more acute here, which does mean the governance of those institutions and the ability of those institutions to evolve, to regulate that system is even more important. And that's a great segue to our next topic. Take it away, Conleigh.
Well, I guess just to add on to that before we go, and we won't go down this rabbit hole, but if you're bringing up Herth, who is of course German, and we're talking about the history of electricity markets, we did not always have security constrained economic dispatch, and we still don't in many regions of the world. In the US, historically, we started out trying to do zonal markets, so using a simplified version of the transmission network or kind of pretending the transmission network didn't exist at all. And it led to problems immediately in PJM, with bilateral schedules that the ISO then no longer had enough resources to actually balance the physical system at that point. It led to problems next door in ISO New England, where they said, okay, the bilateral schedules were a problem. Nobody gets to have bilateral schedules. Now FERC gets involved and says you're having barriers to entry. They have to rethink it. California started out proposing some really solid, to the economic theory ideas, but then ended up in the end having the system that was very obscure prices where, the ISO was just getting, trades from people, unbundled transmission rights. And, we had the California power crisis. And, really the only way we've gotten kind of this separation of this, the economic dispatch without the security constrained part to work is, say in the European system where you have a zonal market, but you have to pay people to not produce. So yeah, it's there's definitely these debates going on now of, how much do you try to make the market look like the physical reality, which is security constrained economic dispatch, versus how much do you try to make the physical reality look like the market, which might mean that you're doing a lot more transmission expansion than would be economical otherwise.
And I know I'm not as familiar with what's going on in Europe, but I know in the UK, which I follow a little more closely, that this zonal, the kind of zonal nodal question is definitely part of the conversation right now.
Yeah, as far as the central administration question goes, I think the way that the UK originally got around this is they said, okay, well, we're one country, or we're one, not one country per se, but for our purposes here, one nation state, and we can say we can task the grid operator with managing the problems that resulted from the zonal dispatch and trying to keep those costs under control. But Europe, where you have interconnections with a bunch of different sovereign nations, that stops working. Yeah. Okay, well, so not going down that wormhole too much, although I think we definitely could.
Energy Northwest is proud to provide clean, abundant, and reliable energy to help meet our growing needs. Energy Northwest is proudly advancing the Northwest's clean energy future.
I knew that.
Yeah, of course.
I knew that. They also have a great training program, which isn't in this promo, but I'll just provide it as a promo as well. They have a great internship program where college graduates can get an internship through Energy Northwest. I've talked about it many times on this podcast. I'm a big fan of that program. Wasn't in this ad read. They didn't write it in, but I'm just inserting it because I'm such a big fan.
All right. Well, sign up, boys and girls. Learn more about nuclear energy and its full potential at energy-northwest.com. That's energy-northwest.com.
So another question is, by designing markets as a tool to achieve the societal outcomes we want, we're implicitly making a bet that structured markets are better at achieving the optimal outcomes than an imperfect central planner. Does the status of portions of electric service as common pool resources, public goods, and club resources change how we regulate institutions participating in electricity markets and how we plan for resource investment?
That's a tough question. And it gets back to the cost allocation, as well. Does it change how we... And I think just given that we just had a little side conversation referring to California, I think if I want to, I don't have a good answer. So I want to structure my thinking about it. I'm going to think back to California in 2001, well, California in 1995. And I think they made a lot of mistakes in market design by I guess I would say having too simple a market model and kind of too econ textbooky a market model, and so for example, we know that in equilibrium in competitive markets, price is equal to marginal cost. And so we're going to put in place some requirements that will basically drive price to marginal cost. But it created a whole bunch of other kind of unintended bad outcomes and bad incentives. And they're worried about liquidity, so they made bilateral contracting illegal. Whereas in ERCOT, they learned from both UK and Pennsylvania and California, and have this combined, bilateral and organized market system. And I'm not sure that if I think about what's a public good, what's a common pool resource, I guess if I think about this question from the point of view of the grid operator and the market operator, and I know in RTOs, they're the same entity, but just thinking of them functionally as separate, but obviously having to communicate with each other because of the security constraint thing, and the reliability mandate, that I guess I think at a very abstract theoretical level of it as that given the complicated fact that some of this basket of grid services that the grid operator needs to have in place in order for to meet their reliability mandate, that some of those things are going to have more public good characteristics, some are going to have more common pool resource characteristics, and that I've lately been thinking about what our TOs are doing is trying to turn all of those public good and common pool resource grid service type services into club goods, right? By basically defining use rights and contracts, and here's how you use it, and here's how you don't use it, and implemented through very laborious stakeholder processes. All of this is a very long-winded way of saying that I think the governance problem, both in terms of how do you determine who can do what, when, and how, and then how do you pay for it, that those are the two biggest sets of governance challenges. And I'm thinking of it in terms of the governance challenge here is they're trying to kind of wrestle all of that to the ground and turn it all into a club good, which makes it more manageable, less congestible. But that's the closest I have to a good answer. And I don't think it's not an operationalizable insight. It's maybe just more of that's how I'm trying to understand it.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of a point you made in one of your Substack posts that I thought was very apt, which is that a good having public benefit doesn't necessarily make it a public good, and it being a public good doesn't necessarily mean it would be under provided in equilibrium. So that, well, maybe not if it is truly a public good, but for a lot of goods, that, the question is more, at the margin of, is there enough incentive for some agent to invest to get those benefits, even if it doesn't get all of the benefits, and some of those accrue to other participants in the market, right? And you could still have the same equilibrium level of investment. And I thought that was a really interesting point that seems relevant here.
And I agree. And it's, that's not an original point to me, so I claim no credit for it, but it's something that I think often bears repeating. And in putting it within this club goods context, and I have to admit, because I think in terms of food and wine all the time. So I think of it in terms of like, a club, and, we're going to have a membership club, and here's the monthly fee. And with this monthly fee, here's how many glasses of wine and how many sandwiches you get per month. And that part of what we're trying to do when we define those terms is to create the conditions in which we're going to hit, at the margin, we're going to hit optimality. And yeah, so that's a form of kind of private provision of a public good, is by turning it into a club good.
Can I follow up on this? Because it sounds like we're turning everything into Costco. That's what our club good is, right? We're turning our grid to Costco. And we're doing that by making sure, and we have enough incentive so that everything's good quality, like at Costco. Everything's great quality. But we have excludability. So there's like access rights and rights to participate that you have to pay for. Is that what you're saying when like RTOs are trying to make everything a club good? So they're kind of taking something from a common pool resource and through investment are shifting it to something that is a club good?
I think that's part of it. And I have to admit that the research I'm working on right now is still very much work in progress. So I haven't fully thought through the logic, but I think it's definitely of if you're going to be a member of this association, whatever we call it,
we're going to Costco.
Yeah, you're going to be a member of this Costco with wires. you're going to buy in and you're going to, pay in X amount, and here are the rights that you get, and here are the responsibilities that you have, and here are the way that we're going to share the costs. And I think, so yeah, I mean, would RTOs work better if we thought of them and structured them and did their governance as if it were a Costco? That's a good question. And I think
Got an episode title. What if RTOs were Costco?
what if RTOs were Costco?
What if Costco took over RTOs? Oh, the Pacific Northwest would love that. That's right on brand.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
I want to.
not be a fan
I had a
of running at the Costco.
I had a follow up here because you had this like line of thought around Ostrom's regular, like the way she characterized how you regulate common pool resources and making sure you have the right structure, to make sure you have the right rules in place, and that whole ecosystem. And I think my framework about like electric service, one of the core functions of electric service is the pooling of priorities across different jurisdictions. And when I followed your line of thought around applying Ostrom to our grid, it did make me think of like the importance of layering the regulation depending on the scope of that service or that community. So like I work for a municipal utility. I have very clear boundaries, and my pooling of priorities is to a very localized sector. A regional transmission organization is pooling different priorities. And I do think of that as like a layering of how do I appropriately govern this common pooled resource in a way that is layered appropriately for what's the term you had for it? The action space that we are operating within.
Yeah,
I wanted to follow up on that. Is there anything there?
I think absolutely that's very much how Ostrom's concept, and you just articulated it beautifully, of polycentricity, that you want the institutions, you want the governance to match essentially where the problem arises, or where the collective action issue is. So, if you're a village in Cambodia and you have an irrigation system and you all need to figure it out, having some muckety muck bureaucrat from Thailand next door even come in and say, you need to do this, that, or even just keeping it within country. If you've got some federal structure, having some bureaucrat come in who doesn't know anything about the local conditions may put in place rules that actually lead to worse outcomes. And so part of the idea of polycentricity is have your governance match the level at which the issue arises, and that takes advantage of the local knowledge. Again, knowledge problem is in play here as well, so that you can get the best feasible outcomes for the people in that community. That's a very Ostromian way of thinking about it. But then you kind of layer it up, and that having the transmission grid operators higher up in that stack, and that they're going to have a different set, the collective action problem that they're dealing with is going to look different. There's probably a similarity, there is a fractalness to this, because we're all worried about grid balance, supply demand balance, reliability, frequency, voltage, but that there's going to be differences as well. And so the polycentricity honors that.
Well, I found that to be, when I was following that train of thought that you laid out, that to be like incredibly valuable to me, especially when it comes to the pacing problem, that the grid operator needs to be able to have good policies and a structure that can adapt for its scale of problem. A utility needs to be able to have a good governance structure that adapts to its scale of problem. And a personal view is there are natural boundaries of what the scope of those problem spaces are. And electric utility like me, line extension policy is one. It like pops up every time. Rate design is another one. Like, how those things are very local concerns, and it is an obligation and a very important function of electric utilities to represent their communities and how those policies are decided and pooled for the community. I could keep talking about this all day. We're running out of time. Like Conleigh mentioned earlier, it's already 11:30 at night in Zurich. Are we ready to play a game or anything else you wanted to add there?
I did want to add something,
Go,
and
go,
if I
Conleigh.
may, as the
Yes.
person who is staying up late at this point, but I'm having a great time, think it's justified. So I hope this is a bit feeding off of this conversation we've been having, but I wanted to introduce the topic of moral hazard. So we've been talking about priority insurance models and thinking about network or system security differentiation above a base level, say, that acts as a guardrail, protecting from extreme cases that, could be life-threatening or unjust. So this is a paraphrase or almost direct quote from one of your Substack posts. To what extent do we think that this guardrail against extreme cases, which I think probably most people here would agree is something that we would find necessary, to what extent can that really be procured from a market? Is that a time where you are introducing this moral hazard problem? And it kind of takes us to this other question of what is the envelope of the market design? What kind of extreme events are we planning for? And how do we, think about this knowledge problem of there's all these different agents in the system who may not even necessarily be able to anticipate the kind of extreme events that they would like to plan for if you leave it up to market forces versus, maybe some central actor could be a bit more forward thinking than those market participants could be, but perhaps they could also, get the level of investment for extreme events wrong at the same time.
Right. And I do think, I mean, this is, and since Paul, you mentioned Jacob Mays earlier, this is a lot of Jacob's work relates to this with respect to resource adequacy and, how do we deal with the challenge of resource adequacy, which can have these moral hazard characteristics. And I guess in terms of the things that I work on, and this is, in the transactive energy work with my co-author, who's basically a applied mathematician and electrical engineer, Dave Chasson at SLAC National Laboratory, the way we talk about this or try to think about it is, because he's more of a physicist type, he thinks of it in terms of phase transitions, right? That for 99.999% of the time, the way we can use price signals to coordinate people's production, consumption, investment, and innovation decisions, that works great. But then you're going to get to those situations where you need to call in ERCOT speak an EEA, right? So you've got an emergency, and that's your phase transition boundary. And once you get into the emergency setting, then the assumptions that make the markets do what they do well no longer hold. And so I think that's, a completely fair way to think about it, is that there's some phase transition where once you're in a physically unstable emergency, potentially physically unstable emergency setting, having some rules in place for how you're going to manage that don't involve markets seems to me to be appropriate. But what markets hopefully should be able to do, and especially when we think about resource adequacy, I think they could do a better job of, is creating the right conditions in the system so that the probability of that emergency event is as low as is cost effective and feasible. So does that make sense with what you were thinking about?
Yeah, I think this is definitely an area ripe for more discussion, and also goes into this question of, where is that phase transition, right? And, you know, so some people would say that that phase transition happens pretty early, that really the tolerance for, especially if we're thinking about from a resource adequacy perspective and just energy prices as opposed to system security, that phase transition might happen at a lower level than people are appreciating, just because the incentive is so strong politically to get involved in the market when there are sustained high prices. So, you know, where that phase transition happens, is it really 99.999% market and this little tiny bit, the central actor operating, or is it, you know, something very different, where, you know, maybe you have a strategic reserve or something that kicks in, or out of market actions that happen, you know, at a much more often. Yep.
I want to do something here, though. I want to keep going on this just maybe one more minute.
Yeah.
Because I am curious if this is intellectually consistent with how we expect resources to recover their capital investment in a spot market, in a deregulated or restructured spot market. And Farhad, I'm gonna pivot to you, because I do think you just recently published some paper talking about the I don't know, the covariance of tail risk and the understanding zero marginal cost resources in the resource mix. And a lot of the market framework, if you were just going to reimburse and rely on spot markets to recover your capital cost, you would need really high priced periods. And where does that happen on this spectrum of this phase shift? And is it inconsistent to have marginal pricing in spots and this acknowledgement that we need out of market actions to deal with this phase? That's what I want to know, Farhad. What do you think?
So I think it's a case in point, when you actually go into the detail of it, was the 2022 Australian market suspension. And that really is a confluence of all these factors that you brought in. Part of which was the challenge was that we were essentially in a high price environment driven by Russia, Ukraine, and all those things. But the price environment was so high that it led to essentially what's called a cumulative price cap coming in. So prices were too high, a cap came into the market. Now, what that meant was that particularly the units that relied on opportunity costs, so like the hydro units, the storage units, the big pump storage facilities that we've got here, could not effectively participate and price that opportunity cost because of the cap. And so especially where they had to, where basically when that cap came in, the price was set at $300. And so for storage, there was no arbitrage, right? So storage has no incentive to kind of go, well, I'm going to dispatch in that market. And hydro was in a situation where it had opportunity costs, but it couldn't price that in the market because of the cap. And so then that price cap actually led to a failure of or insufficiency of dispatch. And so at that point, what happened was the emergency procedures kicked in, and the operator said, well, hey, dispatch is not working, market is not working, in part because we have this cap. We're going to take over this market and administer it and kind of do it the old way, and basically call up folks, tell them what to do, tell them how to dispatch. Everyone's going to get recovered their costs after it's all finished. But that was one example where, part of the cause may be the price cap, but also the fact that you had this emergency domain coming in, and where, the operators and the control room folks, that's really where they kick in. It's like the emergency surgeons of the electricity system. And whatever you say about the outcomes ex post fact, during that situation, which was a tense situation, because it was compounded by coal closures, mine closures, flooding of a range of coal loaders and rail lines, there wasn't actually any directed load shedding throughout that was a period of a number of weeks where they were managing the system on an administrative basis. So I think that also illustrates, when we talk about the market framework, at some point you are going to get into emergency domain, and the procedures and the flexibility and tools are as important as the market settings that you put in place. But the ability for operators to kind of do what is necessary to fix that market, and you kind of create the, you kind of go into it like this, wartime or emergency type of framework where you can do more around the grid to actually get it, make sure that it's safe and secure, and you don't have the scale of interruptions to supply that could have been the case. So yeah, I don't know what it says about what the conclusion will be, but I think it's a kind of combination, right? Like the market kind of works to a level, but at some point when it's emergency, everyone, and that's where it's also like the sort of the altruistic notion does kick in, because you can't possibly direct and go to big companies and say, hey, we need you to do this for the public good, because to avoid, so there's kind of a social license element there.
Ready? We're just gonna do one round of this new game I came up with because I want to play the game. Because frankly, my wife and a couple of our friends spent a weekend thinking of this game and coming up with analogies. It was so much fun. So we're gonna play it. It's called National Treasure, Public Good, or Excludable. It's a lot like a game everybody knows called Marry Kill, or yeah, I did that right. And so I'm going to give you three things, and you have to categorize them as a national treasure, a public good, or excludable. I'm going to start with you, Lynn, for our movie category. National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, Top Gun, or Predator.
Okay, so it's National Lampoon Vacation or
Christmas Vacation.
Christmas Vacation.
Yep. Top Gun.
Top Gun.
Or Predator.
Predator. Oh. I have to admit, I would not say any of the three of them is a national treasure.
Holy cow! Are you serious? Are you serious?
Maybe
they're
Predator.
all national treasures.
Out of the three, if I'm choosing from not my own preferences, I could see how both Top Gun and I could see how all three would be considered national treasures. But from my preferences, I'd probably put them all in public good.
You wouldn't exclude them, any of them though?
No, they're fine.
They're fine. Okay. Okay. Well, that wasn't the funnest example of that instance of the game. We'll try it at the end too. Ahlmahz, National Treasure, Public Good, or Excludable from the recess category. I've got dodgeball, tag, or kickball. Which of them is national treasure? Which is public good? Which is excludable?
I should be embarrassed to say this, but I actually had to look up how do you play kickball. I didn't even know how to play. Yes. And when I read how close it was to baseball, I was like, national treasure, even though I had no idea how it was played. So kickball, national treasure, tag, public good, and dodgeball, excludable, because, you could get hurt with dodgeball.
I mean, that seems harsh to dodgeball. It's both a movie and a recess pastime.
Yes,
would that have been a national treasure?
Dodgeball, the movie, is a national treasure.
Okay, well, finally found Lynn's aesthetic for movies. Okay, Farhad, national treasure, public good, or excludable from the pop culture category. We've got Bluey, Indiana Jones, or Crocodile Dundee.
Well, I mean, I guess in my vintage, maybe I would think Crocodile Dundee would be the national treasure, but maybe that's Bluey now. I don't know. My kids might disagree. So maybe that. And then what were the other two? So Bluey as I would say excludable for me.
Bluey's excludable for you. God, this controversy happening right now. Okay, Indiana Jones and Crocodile Dundee. Which is the national treasure? Which is the public?
So I think national treasure would be Indiana Jones because we've got to just maintain that series, and yeah, we've got to somehow put Harrison Ford in Perspex or whatever, but just preserve that his acting capabilities in those movies. But yeah, so I'd put that as national treasure, and then what was the other one? And Indiana Jones as
Crocodile Dundee, I think, is your public good, right? Yep. So I was actually wondering, this is going to be just a rabbit hole real quick. Is art a public good, non-excludable, non-rivalrous? I can enjoy art. Everybody else can enjoy art. Is art categorized as like a public good? Is that? I'm looking at you, Lynn. What is art?
There's actually a literature in economics on this question. And, there's I would say a general belief that it's a public good and it has public good characteristics. But, part of it, and we talked a little bit about how, I think Conleigh brought up the idea that maybe it's not, public goods aren't necessarily underprovided in equilibrium because people have private kind of self-interested incentives to create, to supply them. And that's where art is. If you really get a lot of gratification out of creating your art, then it's not necessarily going to be underprovided in equilibrium. So that's kind of where the econ literature lands on it.
Love it. Good. My wife and my friends had a debate about art, whether it was excludable or non-rival waste. We do think there are some instances of art which are intentionally rivalrous, and that's part of the art. So Conleigh, you're up next. National treasure, public good, or excludable third spaces. I've got community pools, YMCA, or public libraries.
I feel very seen by this category, Paul. Thank you.
Yes.
So I think I'm going to put YMCA in excludable because I don't have a membership. So it is quite possible to exclude me. Although the one in Cambridge and Central Square, I believe, has a sauna. So they're doing well for those who are not excluded. I'll put public libraries as the public good, even though I guess they are a bit rivalrous still, since I am on some wait lists. Community pools here in Zurich. Oh, that's a national treasure. It's not my nation, but it's a national treasure. There's water slides. It's great. If you expand that out to general community swimming spots, it's a city where the river flowing through it isn't polluted. You fall in the Charles in Boston, you probably want to get out pretty quick. You fall in the lake or the river here, you're just having a grand time.
I love that categorization as the community pool as a national treasure. It has been very hot here in the Pacific Northwest, and I tell you what, it's a national treasure, and gotta love it. Okay, we're gonna close out. I'm doing one last one. This may come back for the season finale. We have a bunch more that I could do. I'm closing out with you, Lynn, from the icon category. National treasure, public good, or excludable. Dolly Parton, Taylor Swift, or Aretha Franklin?
Oh. How do you choose?
You do. The first one, you avoided the question.
Yeah,
you gotta answer it this time.
You let me slide on the first one because I didn't really understand the rules, but now I understand the rules. Oh man, how do you choose?
Well, I can help you. We can exclude Taylor Swift.
Oh,
And I know I am what do you call it? I'm very much the minority opinion there.
Yeah,
I've been hearing Taylor Swift all afternoon, evening here. She's playing at the stadium in Zurich.
Seriously? Oh, that's
Yes.
good.
Oh, that's tough. Yeah, but if I have to make the call, I think I'm going Aretha Franklin, National Treasure, Dolly Parton, Public Good, Taylor Swift, Excludable, but under protest.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it was fine. It was a hard question, and that's what we're going for. That's what's fun about this game. Lynn, thank you for doing this. I hope you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated.
I do, thank you, and right back at all four of you. I really, this has been a great conversation, and I love learning your insights and incorporating them into my future thinking.
Yes, thank you. And this whole time, I have a book next to me, The Big Myth. How American business taught us to loathe government and love the free market. It's been sitting here this whole time, and I just had to bring it up. We made it through the whole thing without me referencing it. Great book. Maybe it differentiates some of our worldviews. Farhad, Conleigh, Ahlmahz, I hope you all feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated. Thanks for doing this.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
To our listeners, while you aren't seen or heard, you are valued and appreciated. Roll on, enthusiasts. Roll on.
We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts.
Public Power Underground is a production of News Data and Seattle City Light. You don't have to be subscribed to News Data's weekly newsletter to get this podcast, but it sure makes the podcast make a lot more sense. The views expressed here are own and not the official views of Seattle City Light, Tacoma Power, S&P Global, News Data, or the organization of the guests also appearing on Public Power Underground. Today's episode was written and produced by Paul Dockery, Ahlmahz Negash, Conleigh Byers, and Farhad Billimoria, and it's edited and published by the stellar team of Pioneer Utility Resources with sound mixing by Lucas Smith and video editing by Brendan Delzer. Our theme song, Roll On Enthusiast, was rewritten, performed, and recorded by Aaron Guillory and Ian Bledsoe. You can find Public Power Underground on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please share with the energy enthusiasts in your life and give us a rating and review on your app of choice if you enjoyed the content. It helps other energy enthusiasts like us find us. Public Power Underground for electric utility enthusiasts. Public Power Underground, it's work to watch.